Fact Nuggets presents the 5 most terrifying airline disasters in history. Number 5. Japan Airlines Flight 123. On August 12, 1985, a routine 55-minute flight between Tokyo and Osaka became the deadliest single aircraft accident ever. 12 minutes into the flight, the plane's aft pressure bulkhead gave way, resulting in a catastrophic explosive decompression in the tail section. The entire vertical fin was torn loose from the fuselage, and all hydraulics for the plane's control surfaces were rendered useless. The pilots attempted to keep the plane under control by opening and closing the throttles, and were even able to change the direction of the plane slightly by giving more power to one side of the plane at a time. But it was a lost cause. The passengers were trapped on a roller coaster ride from hell, with gut-wrenching changes in elevation in the thousands of feet, until the plane eventually collided with a mountain. 520 lives were lost, but the death count alone is not why this flight is on our list. It's the fact that from the time the tail was lost until the plane crashed was an agonizing 32 minutes. Long enough for passengers to realize what was happening, and that there was little chance of survival. Many of them even wrote goodbye letters to their families and loved ones. Amazingly, 4 passengers actually survived the crash and were eventually rescued. Number 4. Korean Airlines Flight 007. September 1st, 1983, a 747 with 269 people aboard is en route to Seoul, South Korea, when it strays from its designated route and inadvertently enters Soviet airspace. It's believed that the cause of the deviation in its route was due to the crew failing to select the correct navigation system options. In 1983, Cold War tensions between the US and Soviet Union were at an all-time high. Both sides were known to perform probing actions, flying dangerously close to each other's airspace in order to provoke and gauge the other's response. One of the planes on the American side that routinely took part in such activities was the RC-135 reconnaissance plane. When viewed from behind, and especially at night, could be mistaken for a Boeing 747, as they are both large planes with slanted wings and 4 engines. As the plane flew closer to Soviet airspace, it was picked up by that country's air defense radar systems. Unfortunately, at that time, there was no simple way for radar technicians to directly communicate with Flight 007. A Soviet Su-15 was scrambled to intercept the passenger plane over Sakhalin Island. The Soviet pilot claims to have made attempts to signal the 747 that it was violating another country's airspace, even using the cannons to fire warning shots. What happened next is murky at best, but what is known is that the Soviet pilot received orders from his command to destroy the 747. He fired 2 missiles, one of which severely damaged the tail section, fuselage, and hydraulics. Flight 007 went into a death spiral. After several minutes, it struck the Sea of Japan, killing all aboard. The Soviets attempted to cover up their horrific blunder by denying that Flight 007 was a passenger plane at all, and refusing to allow access to retrieved wreckage. It was not until after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1992 that the flight data recorders were turned over to the South Korean government. For people affected by claustrophobia, just the thought of setting foot in an airplane can be terrifying. Now imagine being trapped inside of a plane in midair as it rapidly fills with thick black smoke from an unknown source. This is precisely what happened to 301 people aboard a Lockheed TriStar leaving Riyadh, Saudi Arabia on August 19, 1980. Shortly after takeoff, smoke detectors in the aft cargo compartment were triggered. The pilot was able to return to Riyadh Airport and land the jet, but rescue personnel were not immediately able to open the aircraft doors as the plane's engines were still powered up and running. It took several precious minutes for ground crew to shut the engines down, and another 23 minutes for them to figure out how to open the doors. By then, all of the crew and passengers had died of smoke inhalation. Shortly after the doors were open, the plane burst into flames and most of its structure was consumed. The source of the fire in the cargo compartment is still unknown to this day. Number 2. Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571. 13 October 1972. A Fairchild F-27 with 45 souls on board was en route from Montevideo, Uruguay to Santiago, Chile, a route that would take it over the Andes Mountains. Due to the F-27's flight ceiling and weather conditions, the pilots elected to use the Plancon Pass to cross the mountains into Chile. Unfortunately, there was heavy cloud cover on that day, and they misjudged their location when they began their descent. The pilots believed themselves to be safely on the other side of the mountain range. At 13,000 feet, the plane clipped a mountaintop, severing the right wing and destroying the vertical stabilizer. It then lost its left wing to a second mountain peak. What remained of the plane slid down a steep mountain slope before finally coming to rest in a deep snowbank. 9 of the passengers aboard were killed during the crash. By the next morning, 3 more would be dead from injuries and exposure. The remaining survivors would be faced with unimaginable hardship. This was compounded by the fact that they had little food and none of the equipment needed to sustain life in such conditions. One piece of equipment they did have was a small transistor radio, which they could use to hear the news of their own crash and the subsequent rescue efforts. It's hard to imagine their total despair when it was announced that the rescue efforts would cease after just 8 days. At the elevation of the crash site, there is no natural vegetation, or even animals to hunt for food. As the days passed and their meager food supplies dwindled, the survivors were eventually forced to commit cannibalism to survive. 16 days after the crash, the survivors' makeshift camp was struck by an avalanche. This took 8 more lives. Eventually, the group decided that their only chance for survival was to rescue themselves. 2 survivors, Nando Pardoa and Roberto Caneza, volunteered to attempt to hike out of the mountains to find help. After 7 days, they came across a Chilean shepherd, and eventually the remaining survivors were rescued by helicopter. This was 72 days after the initial crash. Number 1. The Tenerife Airport Disaster. On March 27, 1977, one of the Canary Islands known as Tenerife became the site of the deadliest accident in aviation history. A series of unfortunate events and poor decisions led to this disaster. It all started with the bombing of the Gran Canaria Airport, which was the intended destination of 2 Boeing 747s, KLM Flight 4805 and Pan Am Flight 1736. This caused them to be diverted to a much smaller airport on Tenerife, which typically does not accommodate planes as large as the 747. Both planes were able to safely land and await the cleanup to be completed back at Gran Canaria Airport. With only 2 air traffic controllers on duty that day, inevitably confusion ensued. This was compounded by heavy fog setting in, which reduced visibility to just 3 meters. After a lengthy delay, the planes were cleared to proceed to their original destination. The KLM plane was the first to roll out to the end of the runway and turn into the wind. With the KLM 747 still waiting to take off, the Pan Am plane was instructed to proceed down the runway and turn off at taxiway C3. Before the Pan Am plane could safely get off the runway, the captain of the KLM plane interrupted his co-pilot's ongoing communication to the tower with the words, "We're going." He accelerated down the runway and collided with the Pan Am plane at 160 miles per hour. Every one of the 248 people aboard the KLM flight was killed, as well as 335 people aboard the Pan Am plane. Thankfully, 61 Pan Am passengers and crew managed to survive, including the captain of the Pan Am flight, Victor Grubbs.